you so much for taking the time to talk with me today, Dr. Bale. It's a pleasure to have you here on campus with us.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So, it's common belief starting in about the 80s that we were starting to see political polarization. Ever since then, it has been steadily rising. The Pew Research Center shows we're farther apart than we ever have been before. So, first of all, how did we get here? And second of all, are we too far gone?
Yeah, those are the questions. I think, you're right to start with 1980. A lot of people want to point the finger squarely at social media. And, look, I'd love to say I've been researching this for 12 years and I can tell you all Mark Zuckerberg needs to do or Elon Musk needs to do is flip a switch and all this will go away. But unfortunately, the problems I think many experts agree run much deeper. They cut to the core of our political system, how we elect officials, how political parties align themselves in the 1980s, legacy media, the rise of cable news, and what's changed, I think, is that we've reached a point where everybody has a platform, and the editorial function of the media is gone. And so what can happen is, a tiny group of people can suck up all the oxygen and that has huge consequences because it can make us all feel like those people speak for all of us, and they don't.
So I know that that could technically drive polarization and even build up some echo chambers. And part of what your research was, especially when it comes to social media, is about those echo chambers and whether or not sort of breaking that paradigm would help us depolarize a little bit. So I was wondering if you could talk about that research.
When you really start to look at it, you see that echo chambers are actually a lot more rare than people think they are. So the best studies, and these are from places like, Oxford, University of Pennsylvania, Stanford, maybe 1% to 5% of people are in what we might call a political echo chamber, which is to say where they're only getting the same message. So that's a little counterintuitive. The second thing that's counterintuitive, I think surprises a lot of people, is that if you believe in echo chambers, then it should follow that if you're willing to step outside your echo chamber, challenge yourself a little bit, that maybe it should moderate your views, right? That you should be a little bit more open to opposing views or a little bit more able to communicate across the aisle, so to speak. And unfortunately, when we ran a large experiment to test this idea in 2018 on Twitter, we found exactly the opposite. So when we paid people to follow bots that we built that were designed to expose them to messages from the other political party, they actually became more polarized and not less.
Sort of following in that vein, I know that you also did research with generative AI and chatbots and sort of exposing people to other views and having conversations through that. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the results of that study.
Yeah, sure. We all think we're really good at arguing, but really we're all terrible, right? And that explains a lot of what's wrong with social media, right? Like we all think we're much more convincing than we really are. And we lack perspective, many of us, myself included. If you get wrapped up in an argument, why can't someone just accept my way of seeing the world? And the reason is that, as soon as people feel like people are trying to influence them or persuade them, right, our minds throw up all sorts of cognitive defenses to prevent and sort of fight back, right? But an interesting question is, does AI have the same biases? My collaborators and I thought this is sort of an interesting thing to test, because if an AI can sort of patiently help people deliberate or argue more effectively and more productively, maybe this is the kind of thing that could be useful. Everybody's talking about is AI good or is AI bad? And I think the more interesting question is sort of like, what can AI help us do better, right? It's going to do some really good stuff. It's going to do some really bad stuff. But what if we could create an AI chat assistant that allows people to voice their views and sort of learn to communicate them through the eyes of the other side? And when we did this in a large study about 2 months before ChatGPT came out, we discovered it really seemed to move the needle. People had better conversations. People wanted more conversations. And that was really encouraging.
And I've been seeing in the news recently that states across the country are calling cell phones and social media a public health crisis. So what is your take on that? And then also, do you have a cure?
My good friend and collaborator, John Haidt, wrote the book that sort of set off a lot of this, this debate. How much of it is social media versus the many other things that have been going on, right? COVID, the rising inequality, social isolation. Maybe some of those things are driven in part by social media, but social media is probably not the whole story. And I think that's where we're going to see a lot of interesting rubber meets the road moments, because a lot of researchers, scientists want to see randomized control trials before we make any decisions, right? And there just aren't randomized control trials right now. And so what John will say, and I think I agree with him largely on this point, is if your house is on fire, you don't have time to do a randomized control trial, right? You need interventions that are practical and sensible. And so the cost, if he's wrong, seem a lot lower than the costs if everybody else who's sort of defending social media are wrong. So for the time being, I think it's worth the experiments that so many states are rolling out, like New York and others.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me.